Retrofuturista.com. On April 11, 2024, we have the opportunity to interview JG Thirlwell. What initially drew you into the world of music, and how did you begin your career?
Well, I was always obsessed with music. Some of my earliest memories are of music, and I grew up, first listening to the radio, and one of my earliest memories was being in kindergarten and singing the Elvis Presley song "Viva Las Vegas" to a little girl in kindergarten, and then later on, I started getting deeper into it. The first band I ever saw was the Monkees when they played in Melbourne in the 60s. I had to bug my parents to take me when I was like 8 years old or something. And I did learn a couple of instruments when I was younger. The first instrument I learned was cello, and then the second was percussion, but I didn't really, I found it difficult to sight read music. I didn't have very good teachers, and then I sort of gave up on those instruments. But I obsessively, then, as time went by, I was more obsessive about music and read all the music magazines and collected records and went to see bands and then when punk rock kind of came along, it sort of gave you permission to play an instrument without being a virtuoso, which was a revelation to me. So I bought a bass guitar and started teaching myself that. And then when I was 18, I moved to London and from Melbourne, and there I bought another bass guitar and my first synthesizer. And I knew when I moved to London, I knew I wanted to do something in music. I didn't know what it was. And the time that I moved to London was a particularly exciting and fertile time for music. It was 1978, and I lived there from 78 to 83 and saw incredible music. It was a very stimulating, very creative time. It was also the dawn of independent labels and independent distribution and the DIY culture that kind of went hand in hand with the punk explosion. So there were a lot of independent labels. It was possible to press and release your own music, and that's what I did. I spent a small amount of time playing in a band for about 8 months, and spending that 8 months playing in a band made me realize I didn't want to work in a democratic situation. I didn't want to be a member of a band. I wanted to be able to create everything the way I wanted to hear it. And given the limitations of my musical abilities, I wanted to be able to stand or fall by what I created. So I went into the studio and I spent a day and I recorded and mixed both sides of the very first Fetus single at the end of 1980, and came out on the 1st of January 1981. And that was the start of that journey.
Can you describe the first piece of music you ever produced?
Well, I wrote some songs before that. I mean, but they weren't substantial, I would say. I would say, the first, and I had been on recordings before the first Fetus record. That band that I was in called, they were originally called Pragvet and then changed their name to Spec Records for the album that I did. So I was on that album, and I'd worked quite a lot with Nurse with Wound. And that was hugely influential on me as well, in terms of processes. working with Steve Stapleton, who was a really proudly a non-musician, um, that had a lot of ideas and used the studio as an instrument. And he would have, each Friday booked out at this little 8-track studio in Shepherd's Bush in London called IPS. And he invited me down there, and we would go there, and he'd have ideas, and we would just pick up things that were around the studio, like a chair or a ladder, or if he'd find something on the street, didn't matter what it was, or he'd bring some things or a book, or not necessarily instruments. There were instruments there, but we would make recordings, and he would treat them and manipulate them and turn them backwards and cut them up. And by the time he was through with it, it was thoroughly unrecognizable. And that liberation from, if punk rock gave you permission to play an instrument without really knowing how to play the instrument, Nurse with Wound taught me you don't need instruments at all. You don't even need an instrument. You just need ideas. You need sounds. And he had a very deep, he turned me on to a lot of music too. It was also around that time that I started, reading writings by people like John Cage and Stockhouse and getting into that type of theory and about randomness, and getting into the minimalism that was coming up at the time, because people like Philip Glass and Steve Reich were like touring with their bands, and so I saw that type of stuff. But at the same time, I was interested in like funk music and noise music, and what was happening in the independent music scene and soundtrack music, and it all went into the blender. And the very first Fetus single, the first Fetus recording, one of the songs is called OK FM, and the first 3 minutes of that song, it's in two parts, and the first 3 minutes is my kind of version of Philip Glass, who I was listening to a lot at the time, but it's a very demented sort of version of Philip Glass made with synthesizers. And on the back cover of that single, there's a little bit of text that says forthcoming releases, and one of the releases is Fetus on the Beach, which is a reference to Philip Glass's Einstein on the Beach, which is a triple album, because it said Fetus on the Beach, triple album, and Einstein on the Beach is a triple album. So it's definitely like a little love for that minimalism there, although that was blended with, um, uh, certain amounts of chaos and certain amounts of very strict discipline. I always had a composer bent to what I was doing. I was always organized.
What major challenges did you face early in your career?
The thing is about my early career, I started pretty young, and I had a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and it was a time when the independent community was still of a manageable size. The music community now is just so vast that it's very difficult to decipher what's going on. It was much easier to decipher what was going on then. And I was learning as I went along. There's like marked, I think like improvements between each subsequent record that I did as I learned things, and I was coasting on that excitement. So I didn't really feel like there were challenges. All I thought was it was just like I was just doing it, and I didn't feel, that my very first single got played by John Peel. So, that was Um, that was pretty good, even though I wasn't selling tons and tons of records, but I was um, pressing the records myself, distributing them myself, and taking the proceeds of one record and putting it into the next one, and in the first 2 years, I had already made three 7 inches, a 12 inch, and two albums, and which is like pretty prolific. Um, so I was really shot out of the shot out of the barrel of the gun with kind of enthusiasm and it's a million ideas.
How did the experimental music scene of the 80s influence your music and sound?
Well, I talked about Nursery Wound, for example. Um, there was, it was a very fertile time in London. There was It was like an improvisation scene. There was, as I said, before that, minimalism was kind of uh, being performed there. There were, groups like Throbbing Gristle who were playing live, and each time that they played, it was a totally different experience. Sometimes it was like um, it was in a very different environment every time, and the music was different every time. Sometimes it was really assaultive. Sometimes it was kind of very, clinical. Um, so there was just a lot of ideas and a lot of possibilities at that time. And I feel like, what I was doing didn't have any borders. I I drew from a lot of different sources, and as I said, a lot of I was just as influenced by Ennio Morricone as I was by James Brown and by Steve Reich and the pop group. Um, it was a very good time for music.
Over the years, you have collaborated with many artists. Which collaboration do you find the most interesting or prolific?
Yeah, I'm, despite appearances, I'm not a really big collaborator. Um, in the 80s, there was the appearance that I was collaborating more. And I'm not always the best. I've gotten better at collaborating. Um, I did a bunch of stuff with Mark Allman, which I think uh was really important to me and and I think it was a very fertile relationship, and Mark was very open to my ideas, and so that was good. I mean, and then one of my first production jobs ever was this group Coil, um, and that was that was sort of blurring the line between production and mixing and collaborating, and um, with some of the um, material that we were working on, it was very unfinished, and we would sort of finish it off, or they'd come in with sometimes with a full idea, or sometimes with something finished, sometimes something very unfinished. So that was interesting, and it was a challenge, and I've done some production over the years. Um, it's it's I've had an interesting time with production, but it's not something I really want to do. I'm more interested in doing my own stuff. Um, I think the most prolific collaborative partner I've had is actually Simon Haynes, who I'm working with now, who has a group called Tradici Baci. And we've written maybe 30 songs together, or maybe more. Um, some of, we've written a lot of songs for the female voice. All this stuff is not released yet, but I've also written a bunch of stuff with him, which is turned up on his Tradici Baci albums, and it's taken me, it took me 30 years to figure out how to be a good collaborator, and to have someone who I've felt simpatico with, um, where we have a lot of similar reference points of what we want to get across. And for him and I, the world that we're trying to inhabit with some of the music that we're creating together, some of the reference points would be Morricone, Burt Bacharach, Italian soundtracks. Um, but also, we're both very well versed in um, say avant-garde jazz, or um, lots of different areas that we can pull from.
What are some of your favorite piece of equipment?
Well, I always use the studio as an instrument, um, and my music has always been technology driven, even from the very start. I mean, I was always before sampling technology existed, I was doing my version of that, but I was using tape loops and cassettes with pause buttons and turning tape backwards and editing and things like that. And um, so when sampling technology became accessible, it was a way of organizing what I'd been doing up until then. Um, I'd say one of my big mainstays, like, has been for many, many years, and I still use it today, but not as often. But is the Akai S5000 sampler, which is a hardware sampler, and I really like that, and I think it's better than in the soft samplers that are on the market. Any that I've tried, anyway. It sounds better. It's just it transposes better. Um, I'm kind of fast at using it. So as a piece of hardware, I like that. Um, and know that I have, I don't really think of myself as an instrumentalist. Um, it's instruments are a means to an end,
Yeah.
and the end is creating a piece of audio, and so I'll pick up an instrument and play it. I mean, I play keyboards all the time. Um, that's probably my main instrument. Um, but I wouldn't say I have a favorite keyboard. I mean, I have a bunch of stuff here, um, that I use and that have good sounds. But yeah, I'd say if I had to have a fallback, I'd say the S5000.
What are you currently working on, and can you share any details about your upcoming projects?
Yeah, well, for the last 20 years, I've been doing a lot of scoring for television. I've scoring three different animated TV shows, most notably The Venture Brothers, which was on Adult Swim Cartoon Network. Um, and I did that for 7 seasons. And then concurrent to that, I did another animated show called Archer, the music for that, and that just ended last December. Um, it got canceled, and so after 20 years of nonstop doing TV, I finally have a break from it. And I never stopped making my own music while I was doing the scoring. So I have a lot of albums that were in various states of completion over the last few years, which right now I'm finishing. So I just actually finished making the new Zordox album. And Zordox is my electronic project, and this is the third Zordox album. Just finished making that. I'm probably going to be tweaking the mixes a bit, but That's done. I'm working on the first Fetus album for a Fetus album, which will be the first Fetus album of all new material since 2010. Um, and I'm very excited about that. It's also going to be the final Fetus album. Um, I'm working on, it looks like I'm doing another volume of Venture Brothers soundtracks, which I got, and the first volume of Archer soundtracks is coming out. It should be, I think it's out, any day now. It's coming out through Disney. Um, so that's the latest thing. So yeah, and I have several other albums that I'm working on. There's about 8 or 12 albums um, that are in various states of completion. There's also an album of um, that I'd like to complete an album of soundtracks for Ken Jacobs. I have two projects, one called Color Nocebo and one called Silver Mantis, um, which will turn into albums. The Color Nocebo one's already recorded. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of stuff. Um, I, because I have this backlog of music that I want to get out, I have to increase my output because otherwise I'm going to be 100 years old by the time all this stuff comes out. So I've got to try and make it so that I'm releasing 2 or 3 albums a year.
What music are you currently listening to, and are there any new artists who have captured your attention?
Um, well, I'm always looking for new music to listen to. I publish a playlist every month, which I publish on my Tumblr blog. And that gives you a sense of the music that I'm listening to at any one month. Um, I would say like in the last few years, um, one label that I've been very excited about is called Dur et Du, which is a label from Lyon in France. And they release a lot of bands from Lyon. Um, and there's something about those bands that there's something very creative about those bands. They seem to be informed or influenced by, some of them are informed and influenced by, groups like Magma or Universe Zero, the kind of like rock in opposition, Zoil type groups. But the groups um, on Dur et Du are like bands like Poil, Poil, and Ni, Ni, and uh, Orchestra Spam, and uh, who else? Oh, uh, what are the other bands? Oh, there's a bunch of bands on that label that are really good, and um, I was lucky enough to be in London last year when Poil played in their guys as Poil Waiter, where they're doing a project with a Chinese, I want to say Chinese singer, um, and it's outside of the scope of what they normally do. Um, but there's still their own personality is very much in there. Um, and that was really an exciting show. There's a here in New York. I go to a lot of concerts, and uh, we're lucky in New York to have what I think is the most fertile contemporary classical new music scene in the world. Um, and there's a stunning amount of great music comes out of here, um, which you can see on almost any night of the week. Um, some of the things I saw there's groups like, say, Jack Quartet, who are a string quartet who are incredible players and play an incredible repertoire of music. So percussion, we're a percussion quartet. There's institutions like Bang on a Can and um, uh, International Contemporary Ensemble, ICE, and um, Wet Ink, Yarn Wire, who are a two piano, two percussion ensemble. So there's a lot of really inventive, exciting new music that comes out of New York and a lot of exciting composers. So that's very stimulating. And I go and see a lot of shows. Um, so yeah, but I listen to tons of stuff.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Please consider subscribing to Retrofuturista.com.